Thank
So
you.
one of the things I was wondering, just sort of a way to start our conversation, is it always intrigues me how or what motivates people, either professionally or personally, or what their sort of life goals are. So I'll start with that question, and then we can just see where the conversation takes us.
That
What
sounds great.
motivates you?
Yeah, and I'll ask you the same one because I want to hear
Okay.
your answer to this too. But so for me, I think the thing that motivates me more than anything else is learning new things. And I was thinking about it, and I think that applies not just in my work, but across my life in general. So we'll talk about this later, I'm sure, but I craft. That I would say that's my primary hobby. And people ask, what kind of crafts do you do? And I'm like, name one. I've done it because my favorite thing is to learn new ones, which is the problem for my craft supply stash. But work wise, I would say it's the same. I think faculty in general should like to learn, I hope, new things. I feel like the day you stop learning new things is probably the day that you're no longer going to be great at your job. Um, and I would say related to that, it's the students and their interests that inspire me to learn more and different things. In particular, I love teaching the proposal development class because in that one, everyone has so many different interests. And even just through discussions with the students and then through reading their proposals in the end, I feel like I learn so many new things that I never otherwise would have encountered. So yeah, learning new things.
Okay.
What
Well,
about you?
I'm gonna follow up on that before you turn the
Yeah,
question,
yeah,
because your background is new to me, and I usually see the crafting background. So can you
yeah.
tell us a little bit about the guitars?
I can, yeah. So I have played piano since I was 7. And we used to have my old upright piano here. And when my kids were toddlers, I have two boys. They're now 11 and 8. But when they were very young, they started just naturally gravitating toward the piano. And we were both very surprised that it wasn't just your, banging, that they were actually starting to pick out songs, even from as young as like 2 or 3. And so we eventually upgraded the piano. And my husband also is musical. He plays most of the stringed instruments you see behind me. I've learned the ukulele a little. I can't, I've tried the guitar, but I am a wimp about the calluses. So I
Yeah.
stopped. It hurt. I didn't like that. But yeah, we're very musical. We love Guster. You can probably see the poster. It's our favorite band as a family. We got to see them this summer, which inspired a whole new explosion of musical interest. So we've been trying to play some Guster songs together. And Ben Folds, we went to see him. Yeah, so we're all into music as a family. It's been great.
Very
This used to
cool.
be our dining room, by the way. So we never ate in it. It's not like our house is super fancy. We have our own music room. This was the dining room. We took the table out. Now it's a music room.
Fair enough. No, that's great. I hadn't known that about you, so seeing the piano and the guitar back there is kind of cool. And I love the sign. The sign, Rawson's world famous music lounge, is that's great.
Yeah, yeah. So I'll throw that same question back at you. What motivates you?
Um, a number of things motivate me. I also love learning, but I think for me, the thing that I have always wanted, from a very young age, is I knew what kind of grandfather I wanted to be. Not that I knew I would get married and have children and ever possibly have grandchildren. I don't yet, but that may come. But I knew the kind of man I wanted to be as a grandfather, and that was the kind of grandfather who would take the grandchildren out um, on nature trails and teach them about nature and life, and would be full of stories. Right. I mean, stories were always important to me, even as a young man, and as a child, reading. Certainly, I loved reading. Um, but the intent was always to build a set of skills that I could use to um, entertain and help grow up grandchildren if I ever had them. And then I had the wonderful realization that I was now married and I had a child and I could do the same things with my kid so I didn't have to wait for grandchildren. Um, and so with my son, I have tried to grow him up with the same sorts of love of nature and what it's like to love stories and listen to stories and craft stories. The nature thing hasn't really taken with him. He's not a big nature freak the way I am. I love being outside. I love gardening. Um, Not so much vegetable gardening. I haven't been as successful with that as I am with flowers and trees and bushes and landscape kind of design. But that's my therapy. It's also to some extent, my destruction because it's amazing how you can hurt yourself out in the garden. I'm currently recouping from too much digging in
Mm.
our beautiful North Carolina clay and ended up with a huge blister on my hand. And
Ouch.
I'm now finding it more difficult to do even things as simple as typing, right, are painful as I recover from that. But I guess the other thing I would say is that and this goes along with the gardening idea, is that I've always wanted to feel that my creative energy has been directed toward increasing the beauty in the world. And so whether that's through storytelling, whether that's through teaching, whether that's through gardening, whether it's the way I play sports, all of that has been done to try and have this level of increasing the beauty of the world and making it a better place.
Yeah, I would say that that's a big part behind my crafting too, because I love that something tangible comes out of it. Uh,
Yeah.
Even if I'm the only one that thinks it's fun or pretty at the end, it's nice. Do you have this is a silly question, but do you have your grandfather name picked out? Do you want to be called grandfather, grandpa, papa?
Oh, oh, I see what you're saying. I actually haven't thought that far in advance. I think probably grandpa would work, would feel most comfortable. I've thought of some of the other, Gramps or whatever, and it would be up to the child to make that call. I'd be happy if I have a grandchild.
My dad wanted to be
Spring
called
chicken
Grampy.
anymore. So, my son is 17. So, whether he decides to marry late as I did or marry at all, we'll wait and see what his life brings. But it's exciting right now because we're all involved in getting ready for college and college searches and applications, writing applications, all of that stuff.
I can't believe that. I have to say because I remember him when he was about 5 or 6.
Yeah.
Um, so it is really hard to believe that he's that old.
Well, and with I mean, that's the age that I really, really love. I mean,
Mhm.
I like youth in general. It's been the focus of my whole life has been focused around youth. But the 4, 5, 6 year old child is just, for me, it's magic. And so when he was that age and the kinds of imaginative games we could play, um, I love that age group. So I remember him very fondly as a 4, 5, and 6 year old. He's a great adolescent as well. As I say, he's 17 now. He's going to be a really wonderful young man, I think. And I'll credit my wife for most of his upbringing. I've been the second caregiver. She's been the primary one. And she's done a phenomenal job with him, raising him and getting him to grow and develop as a well-rounded human, right?
It's
Um,
exciting. It is
yeah,
exciting to see them like come into their own. I'm just sort of at the beginning of that, but my older son is now in 6th grade, which is just wild to me because that's the grade I used to teach before I came to Sills. And it's just this big mental disconnect. I'm like, no, he's not the same age as those kids I used to teach, but he is.
yeah, yeah. It's remarkable how time flies.
Yeah, yeah.
Speaking of pedagogy, that's a nice segue into one of the other things I was thinking about, because you teach the pedagogy and instruction class,
Mhm.
and are an award-winning teacher here at Sills. Um, what about pedagogy, or what tips or tricks do you have that make you such a great teacher for our
Oh
students?
gosh. Well, that's a very flattering question. Thank you for the way you phrased that.
Yeah.
I mean, I tell my students that, um, I don't think there is any one secret to being a good teacher, because I think that everybody brings their own experiences and backgrounds to it. But for me, what I have learned over time is that the more authentic that I can be, the truer to myself that I can be with my students, and that's like, that's not just sharing, my personality, but also being willing to talk about my own, what's going on in my life, or being willing to admit when an activity that I am doing in the classroom is not going the way that I thought it would.
Mm,
Um, I feel like that has been the key that has unlocked, um, the past decade, I would say, of feeling really good about myself as a teacher.
mm,
Um, it's just, there's such a sigh of relief when you can be yourself, and you don't feel like you're, well, for me, for me,
mhm,
when you don't feel like I'm performing. Because when I first started teaching, I was given the advice that, pretend like you're on stage. This is, you're an actor. You put on your teacher face. And I tried, and I hated it. I was so stressed, because I just didn't feel like that was me, and it wasn't me. I was trying to pretend to be the teachers that I had encountered
mhm.
growing up, and I stuck with that for a long time, even though it was demonstrably not working. And the time that I gave that up, I think I became such a better teacher. So that's my number one
Mhm.
piece of advice to my students, is just sort of be yourself, figure out who that is, what you're comfortable with, what works for you, and that's going to be different, for everybody. But
Yeah.
I do really love teaching that class, because, I mean, for so many reasons. I can nerd out about pedagogy all day. My first master's was in teaching, but I also spend an inordinate amount of every day thinking about teaching, whether it's planning for it, reflecting on how it went, grading stuff, interacting with students. That is my job, and I consider myself really fortunate to be in a place where I can do that, because I do really love it.
Yeah, but and it's obvious. I mean, it's when you hear someone talk about what they really love and they're passionate about, as a storyteller, it's fun to watch, because your whole body changes, your face lights up, everything gets, the excitement is tangible when you get to do that. Now, it's interesting you were talking about being your authentic self, because I had a long conversation with my mother when she was still alive about teaching. She was a grade school teacher. My father was a university professor. My brother is a university professor, and I'm a university professor. So it's kind of runs in the family. But I think the conversation I had with her, she was British, and very much of the British hierarchy kind of approach to life and society. And I got my doctorate and started teaching here at UNC. And she said, during a conversation, she said, "Brian, what do you have your students call you?" And I said, "Well, I have them call me Brian." And she said, "Brian, you've worked really hard to get that doctorate. You should get them to call you Dr. Sturm." And I looked at her and I said, Mom, I've, but yeah, I worked very hard to get my doctorate. It took me 8 years to get that, but I've worked a lot harder to become Brian than I have to become Dr. Sturm. And so I'd rather they call me Brian. I don't want the student teacher relationship to be this big divide of anything, right? I mean, I really want them to interact with me as a human. And it sounds to me as though all of your strategies are doing a similar kind of thing of saying, listen, I'm a human first, and talk to me as a person. And then if the academic piece of it is necessary, or if it's more comfortable for you, then go ahead and call me by Dr. Sturm. Or I had one group that called me Sir Brian because they said Dr. Sturm is too formal and Brian is too informal. So can we call you Sir Brian? I said, sure.
I've had a couple students call me Dr. Casey for the same
Dr.
reason,
Casey. Yeah,
which
right.
is great. Yeah, and I tell them the same thing, by the way, that I'm happy to be called Casey, but I also came from a military family, and so interestingly, I got similar advice from my parents that, oh no, it's you need to foster respect in the classroom. You need your Dr. Rawson. I'm like, that's not me.
Yeah. Well, and respect is definitely earned, and it's not earned by a title,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Uh,
Yeah.
you can get power by a title, but I don't think you get respect from a title
No.
usually.
Yeah, I don't think so either. And certainly, yeah, certainly my own experience has not supported
Yeah,
that idea. I
yeah,
mean, I
no,
was I was called Mrs. Rawson or Ms. Held the whole time I was teaching middle school, and I can tell you that did not lead to automatic respect.
yeah. Well, and I think some people get the doctorate thinking that it will grant them some sort of level of respect, and I guess in society it does to some extent. The honorific there is it has some power in society. Um, but I've certainly felt that the relationship you develop with students is so much more, to use your word, authentic, without that, if they're comfortable with it, right?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
find that it also helps them be their authentic selves when they have someone who's modeling that for them.
Mm,
Um, that the engagement in class is just so much better when everyone is comfortable to come as they are and be who they are in that space, not
mhm.
just with me, but with each other. So yeah, it's something I always try to model. I'm sure I fail at it sometimes, but that's my goal.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's something to work for.
So I have a question for you.
Okay.
Um, you probably everyone on the call knows, but you're currently transitioning out of the associate dean role, which you held for 3 years and did an amazing job with.
Thank you.
So I'm wondering, what are you most looking forward to about being a regular faculty member again?
Um, I guess I would say the change from a work life that is very much focused on stamping out fires
Mm,
and sort of reacting to immediate needs, and your inbox that sort of explodes as an administrator, um, to a little more focused time of writing and doing some more research, which I had almost no time to do as an associate dean, um, and to actually spend a lot more time thinking consciously about the courses that I teach, because teaching is really my love. I mean, I got into teaching because I wanted to teach. Um, and so getting back to and having the time to really spend thinking about the courses and the design and the content, and every year I try and tweak the classes and make them a little bit better. But there's some of them that could use a pretty thorough overhaul, and I haven't had the time or the luxury to do that. So having the time to do that is exciting. And I do have a lot of projects that I started, some of them several years ago, that I haven't had a chance to finish and write up and submit for publication. I'd like to do that. I have a storytelling book that I have wanted to write for many years, that would be sort of the culmination of all the different pieces of how I think about storytelling and how I teach storytelling. So that is a book that is on my to-do list for the next year. Whether or not I finish it or not, we'll wait and see. But I've got a good start on it already. And then I actually had a book contract about 12 years ago that was for a book on creating immersive children's libraries. And I was really excited about writing that, and then it got bogged down and never came to fruition. And that's a a project that I really do want to spend some more time with. It got bogged down because I got into one of the chapters on physical space design in libraries, and realized that I had a huge amount of background reading that I needed to do in order to speak with any um, authority on space design. I mean, right down to the use of color and how colors impact and affect people. There's a whole literature on that, and I mean, I knew some of the generic things like, you know, warm colors and cool colors, but the details of it I didn't know, and I wanted to be able to cite reputable sources, and a lot of the sources there were sort of, well, let's say less than reputable.
So I can imagine, yeah, I can imagine a lot of it was like people trying to sell things to libraries, right?
Right, right.
Yeah.
And not based on good science. So that project is something that I want to resurrect and get back to eventually in the next, you know, before I retire. I'd like to have that book out. Um, but it was a project that I thought, yes, I can do this, and then I realized, no, I can't actually do this, and carry on the rest of the opportunities and responsibilities that I had.
That
Uh,
sounds really fun and something that certainly has not, the relevance of that has not lessened in the 12 years that you put it aside. So I can imagine there'd still be quite an interest in that book.
I think so.
Yeah.
I hope so anyway. You know, it's always too bad when you do a large manuscript or something like that, and then it doesn't get the traction that you hope for. But I think the my feeling is that an immersive children's library is actually somewhat different from the modern push, and development in children's libraries, because there's there's almost what I would call almost a focus on, and I think it goes in relationship to the library, the public library as community space, as opposed to information space, right?
Mhm.
That there has been a huge push toward redesigning our spaces to be, for children, very engaging physical spaces. So, I mean, I've sort of called it to myself. I call it the Disneyfication of public libraries, because you can go into some of these and they're, I mean, just myriad bright colors and dioramas, and you know, there are themes, whole themes
Mhm.
to it. And you walk in, and the physical space is both engaging and, I think for some kids, probably overwhelming.
Sure.
Um, but in the process, what happens is the space becomes a place to look at and be in, but the information in that space, you know, the books, the technology, whatever, starts to look kind of second place and second rate, because the books are used and they're, you know, they're not all new and sparkly, but the building itself is all new and sparkly. And so how do we balance the design, the physical space design, so that the immersion is partly in the place, but also the immersion is in the information and the opportunities that that space provides. So that I'm not convinced that we're on a road that will give us the best information children's libraries. And but I also, I mean, the modern trend is in public librarianship, at least, is not to focus on the information as much.
Yeah. It's about getting people in the door a lot of the time.
Right.
Yeah.
And providing a space where they feel comfortable and excited to be, whether or not they're using the information resources that we provide. Right.
I wonder for the children's spaces in particular, how much of that is driven not by the kids, but by their parents uh, who want to go to the library to get, have their kids have a fun time.
Mm-hmm.
It's a socialization space, I think, for especially for young parents. I know it was for me that the library was one of the few free places that we could go on a rainy day, and I could take my kids and meet other moms while my kids played. But you're right that maybe secondary to the what the mission of the public library is.
Well, I think it's certainly secondary to what the mission has been,
Yeah.
right? But I think that the new mission seems to be heading toward the library as the new space, the new social space. And if that becomes the trend and the predominant mission behind what we do as librarians, then this new design is fine, right? I mean, it focuses on the library as community space, exciting, attractive, engaging. It'll be the library, perhaps a little bit more of the library as children's museum.
Yeah.
You know,
It actually reminds me of some of the things that we heard from the youth services librarians that we talked to as part of our IMLS grant, which um, I'll skip the details in favor of getting exactly to what they said, which was that so many public spaces are now being eroded or eliminated that the library is taking on more and more and more that's outside of their traditional mission. So now the library is expected to be a community space, but it's also expected to be, you know, a social worker area and a voter registration site and.
yeah.
And I don't think that that's a trend that is sustainable in the long term unless libraries also start hiring people who can fulfill those extra roles. But I certainly think it's a challenge for those of us who are preparing public librarians to go and work in those spaces, to even get a real sense of what the job is right now.
Yeah. Yeah. So that I think you're right. That sense of job creep is something that we heard over and over and over with the folks we talked to. You know, how do you be everything to all people? How do you be that inclusive and do anything really well, right?
Yeah.
And then for us who are training them or educating these librarians, how do we give enough time in a curriculum to these sort of social, sociological, psychological issues without getting rid of, or maybe we need to get rid of some of the sort of more traditional focuses that we've had as academics. Um, and the grant was wonderful. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed working with everyone on that, and Sandra was great there too, and Chimindu when he was with us. It was nice to have his input as a technologist as well. But the sense of, you know, how do we become an institution as educators? How do we provide an education that is that has all of the sort of coping structures, coping strategies, the human interpersonal coping strategies that our students are going to need to have because they're interacting with people, right? I mean, that sense that that the public library is an institution that is primarily focused on people, not on resources, was one of the takeaways that I had.
Oh yeah, that I mean, and our participants said that over and over, right? That this is not a job where you're going to be reading in a quiet space all day. You know, you are working with people, all sorts of people, all day.
Yeah.
And that's very different than what I think a lot of people have in mind when they come here. So I think part of it is like our job to sort of acculturate students to what the job really is versus what they might have thought it was coming in.
Mm-hmm. And then the traditional curriculum, right, that library and information science schools use, especially for youth, I think is fairly heavy toward the resources. I mean, we have the children's lit and the young adult lit and even for adults, we have here at Sills, we have our what's that? What's the class we do for adult literature?
Seminar in popular materials.
Popular materials.
I'm
That's it.
teaching it now. I
Yeah,
love it.
yeah.
It's been so great.
You know, and then you say, well, what happens if we get rid of those? What do we become? And I think that's both the challenge and the exciting future for Sills is to say, how do we become that without losing so much of the value and the integrity of the program that we've had for what, getting close to 100 years, I guess.
Yeah, a very long time.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It's been great chatting with you, Casey.
It has. Yeah, the half an hour flew by. I was nervous about this, not gonna lie, but
Yeah,
you're very easy to talk to, Brian.
so are you. All right. Well, we'll sign off then, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks, you too.
All right.